to all of you, an academic whose work I deeply admire and respect, and above all, he's also a very good friend of mine, Dr. Alan Chong, who is a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University of Singapore, NTU, and who's based at the Center for Multilateralism Studies at RSIS. Alan and I have known each other for a long time, and as I was mentioning to Alan earlier, one of the abiding interests that both of us have is the decolonization of international relations as a discipline. And I think that is something that has already begun to take place in many universities in the world, both in the West and in the East. And I think Alan's effort at foregrounding this agenda is very important. In a way, it's related to the theme of today's discussion. Now, today, of course, we'll be looking at a very interesting topic. The title that has been given to us is Between Nationalism and Internationalism, Soekarno and Lee Kuan Yew on Postcolonial Foreign Policy Dilemmas. Those of us who are here in Southeast Asia, I think would be familiar with this, as decolonization swept through Southeast Asia in the 40s and 50s. Every single country in this region was faced with the dilemma of where to locate itself in the wider landscape of geopolitics. And I think one of the tragedies of Southeast Asia is that whatever choices given to us was a false choice, because we were caught, we were immediately dragged into the logic of the Cold War. Now, today's talk, I suppose, can be located within the broader discipline of international relations. And I think international relations, at least for some of us, suffers from its own limitations, not least of which is, firstly, the tendency to always locate everything in the present, what we call presentism, the absence of history in IR analysis, and also the tendency in some IR to see and think of nation states as if they were individual human beings, this anthropocentric tendency to present countries as if they were individual human beings. That's not necessarily the case. However, in the context of Southeast Asia, there was a time when some of the countries of Southeast Asia were very much dominated by the personalities of its leaders. So there is some justification in highlighting the individual subject positions of the people who led these countries. That's partly due to the very personalized nature of power and authority in this part of the world. And in that context, in that broader context, Alan will address this issue of how Singapore and Indonesia, during a very specific time, when it was under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew and Soekarno respectively, dealt with this need to carve out a sense of identity on the stage of international politics. And so without further ado, Alan, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, in my usual lecture style, I like to pepper my slides with lots of pictures. In the interest of time, I've reduced the number of pictures, but again, pictures do tell you a story, and they give you a kind of nice flavor to what is coming on in terms of my spiel, my words, and so on. Okay, I won't go through the title with you. Farish has already gone through that. Now, this was nicely plucked off the internet yesterday. It shows a collage of President Sukarno's friendships, and he claims these are all personal friendships with important world leaders from the late 1950s all the way to his ejection from office around about late 1965. Okay, so he could claim that he's a personal friend of Fidel Castro, Nikita Khrushchev of the erstwhile USSR, even President Kennedy was called a friend. All right. I'll be happy to share with you the paper that is currently still a work in progress, where I have this long quote. His relationship with the Americans, okay, you can ask me to elaborate on it later. It's somewhat complicated. Although he claims, both John F., the president, as a personal friend. He also claims that his brother, the Attorney General at that time, Bobby Kennedy, also as a personal friend. And on top of that, his most detailed biography was written by an American journalist with whom he's had, I think, a hint of something more than a professional friendship, right? And he also claimed also to be a friend to everybody in the Africa Asian Conference, and this is of course somewhat controversial as of today. Uh, Picture of him trying to entertain Zhou Enlai, the long-serving premier under China's Mao Zedong. And of course, for Lee Kuan Yew, unfortunately, I don't have a spectacular spread of pictures. Those of you from the Commonwealth countries, and the Commonwealth, mind you, is a collection of ex-colonies, still, sentimental towards Britain in some way. All right, so this is from 1971 when Singapore hosted the first CHOGM meeting. All right, now what's driving this research is this idea that when you look at nationalism in the steering hands of the first generation of nationalist leaders or post-colonial leaders in Southeast Asia, and of course I can't feature everybody, just two samples. Perhaps in a parallel work I might cover Sihanouk. Sihanouk is much misunderstood, controversial, but still more or less within this framework, and potentially, I think Diosdado Macapagal of the Philippines. Again, I haven't gotten to the preliminary research on these two, but these two, Sukarno and Lee, I've read enough of them, I think, to be confident enough to stand before you today. Now, nationalism, you have to understand, is an extremely arduous quest in the evolution of an independent post-colonial Asia. And I stress an arduous quest because you need to tell your newly liberated populations you are now one people, self-determining. Okay, and it's very hard to get into people's heads this idea that you are self-determining after centuries of colonialism, when the foreign power tells you you're not full human beings, you're inferior. That's why we from afar, from Europe, need to be your masters, and so on. So, to say that overnight you're now a nation, of people unto yourself, it's a huge jump in mindset. Okay, so once you have charismatic leaders like these two, they have to engage in some degree of philosophizing, theorizing, doctrine building, and so on. Of course, you can say that this is a lot of propaganda. All right, true. I won't contest that claim, but you have to understand that they had to do this because if you are to move past the legacies of colonialism, you need to be fully aware that your own collective destiny has to be authored virtually as tabula rasa, a blank piece. All right. And then you have to write your own story. Okay. Now, if you think about it, there's also this backdrop of trying to be modern. The idea of a nation state, whether your European nation state or even a post-colonial nation state, as in the non-West, is a modern project. Okay, and it is also very unsettling because all of a sudden, to be a self-determining nation, you must embrace the language of science and modernity. All right, and this is a struggle that's still live in Southeast Asia. Again, I don't need to talk about the local context here. Why is it that you have fundamentalists, or rather parties that draw their ideology from a fundamentalist version of Islam, for instance, and so on? Is it because modernity is uncomfortable, it's unsettling? You're, in a sense, replacing what you used to believe as, a transcendental God with something that's materialistic. Okay, so it's a very unsettling experience to embark on a new journey after colonialism has been formally kicked out. Whether it's been informally uprooted, okay, that is the big question that we're dealing with. So if you were in the shoes of Lee and Sukarno, you realize that the path forward has to balance between these two extremes. On the one hand, your nationalism must banish the past, or at least keep bashing it. All right. Colonialism has to be removed in some way. You cannot make peace with it in an absolute sense. But at the same time, to be a self-determining nation state in a modern sense, you need to fit into modern international society. Okay, and if Fox News is correct, and if Trump gets into the White House a second time, he will have to, in a sense, deal with this painful dilemma too. How can you be a rabid nationalist at home and yet, carry on trade as normal with your usual trading partners? So this is a sort of challenge that Sukarno and Lee were facing at the time. So if you need a research puzzle to follow throughout my presentation, I've given it to you here on the first slide. How did Southeast Asia's first generation of post-colonial leaders deal with the dilemmas of pursuing strident nationalism while attempting to integrate into the international community? Okay, it's several dilemmas that you can point to. That's why I put it in plural in the title, because if you say that you need to be proud of yourself, you need to rely on yourself, how is it that you can be at peace with other new nation states and with the former colonial powers? Okay, so this is the overarching challenge. All right. Now, as we get into biographies, and this is where my methodology is somewhat different from people who are doing mainstream international relations theory. I read the biographies as a contribution to their understanding, their thick understanding of what it means to deal with international relations. Biographies are important because if you have strong leaders, charismatic leaders who say that I want to put my imprint on what my colleagues, what my entire cabinet lays out as foreign policy, their prejudices in their personal history come out. All right. So I'm going to talk about outrage, outrage against colonialism and awareness of colonial subjugation. Now, I connect my interim paragraph here. Colonial repulsion by colonialism is introduction to the national international nexus, to Professor Nor's ongoing research about the very twisted and perverse nature of colonialism. Now, colonialism is not about physical displacement. You can say that it is that too, but it's also more cynically about trying to uh, displace people's pre-existing conceptions of themselves, of where they are in the world. And we're still dealing with this, right? Especially those of you who believe that your university education is a stepping stone towards the wider world. And you need to ask, okay, now that we're in the shadow of a possible second Trump administration, uh, is the West willing to accept the non-West as professionals, as equals, as colleagues in the same multinational workplace? Okay, if your answer or if your personal experience is the answer is likely to be no, then decolonization isn't done. All right, a lot of people's minds. All right, and I'm aware that there's this thing called the MTV generation out there, or the YouTube generation, or the social media generation. You assume that these friends you make on social media, they are all like you. All right, the point is they're probably not. They carry from somewhere else. And when you engage or consume popular culture, okay, I'm uh, diverging a little. You have to understand that there is baggage from somewhere else. As icons of popular culture come assuming that you're all friendly towards them because we're all equals. Uh, you know, if you are put on the same panel or in the same workplace, there's a good chance all the prejudices received from somewhere else or a different era are still there. So decolonization is never complete until you actually keep at it, keep pushing it back. Uh, so now there's a bit of biography reading in my paper where I look at Sukarno's own experience. Okay, his parents and grandparents were all aristocrats. And those of you who have studied, and I believe a good number of you have, the way the Dutch took over the East Indies, okay, present-day Indonesia, they actually tricked or enslaved the pre-existing aristocracy. It's not as if the East Indies had no government. There was. It's just that the Dutch said, I want to take it anyway. So they used both fraud and assassination and other kinds of strategies of marginalization to get rid of the existing local power structures. And Sukarno's family was a victim to that. And this comes out in his biography. It was very visceral. All right. And this is also where he learned elements, and I stress only elements of political realism, meaning you want to get rid of colonial power, you want to wreak this vengeance on them for having destroyed your family's original aristocratic heritage and so on. You have to use power. All right, that comes out clearly from Sukarno's early thinking as well as his subsequent insights as revealed to his biographer. Okay, now Lee Kuan Yew's anger against colonialism took a while longer. All right. And this is in the nature of Singapore because the British, when they created Singapore as a commercial colony, okay, and again, with all due respect to any of you who are doing business degrees, because business degrees, okay, as he well knows from our time in RSIS, I keep bashing the business school. Okay, with all due respect, in case anyone is from the business school here, you see, when you think about business school professors don't want you to think about politics. It's all about getting into the consumer's minds. Politics doesn't matter. I just want to sell. I just want you to buy. Nothing political. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm not putting you down. I just want you to be a customer. But the point is, business relations, business relationships also hide colonialism. All right. So Lee Kuan Yew took a while to get this anti-colonial rage out because his family got by. It was fairly well to do by colonial standards. All right. His grandparents serviced the British Merchant Marine. Okay. If you read his biography, he openly admits to it. It was not an unpleasant life under the British because the British merchant captains seemed to treat his grandparents with respect. He had very little to say about his father. Again, that's another story. But his grandparents were a strong influence on him in terms of why he did not develop strong anti-colonial feelings early on. It was only during the Japanese occupation. Now, this is also where Sukarno and Lee diverge in terms of their personal experiences. As all of you probably know very well, when the Japanese came into the Dutch East Indies, they wanted local collaborators. So Sukarno said, okay, if was one way to speed up independence from the Dutch, I will work with the Japanese. Okay, but in the case of Singapore, it was harsher because the Japanese, as part of their new East Asia co-prosperity sphere, were very genocidal in their view towards ethnic Chinese. So that soured things. And Singapore existed under Japanese administration for about 3 years under a very totalitarian climate of fear, something you might experience in, say, Putin's Russia today. You know, you're being watched. And whenever the Japanese don't like certain social tendencies, they'll make an example of that person. And Lee, in his biography, records that the spectacle of Japanese soldiers beheading looters was a very chilling sight. Okay, and so what did he pick up from the Japanese colonial experience? If you visit vicious violence, okay, you actually can subdue a population. Okay, it was a chilling insight. All right, and that's how he learned the importance of power. Because under the Japanese, once they made an example of these looters by beheading them and showing their heads in front of the famous Cathay Cinema, which is still there in Singapore, people get the message. Don't ever disobey the Japanese, otherwise you'll end up like that, and so on. Now, his next his next experience of outrage came when he studied in the UK. All right. Now, this was post-war Britain, a Britain that was set for decline. Britain won the war on the side of the Allies and so on, but it was a country that was bankrupted, fighting a Second World War. All right. So when he studied for his law degree between 1946 and 1949. He was unhappy, very unhappy living in London because it was still bombed out and they haven't repaired a lot of things. And the British were still fearful of losing the empire. So he didn't like London. He moved to Cambridge. But the prejudice followed. All right. It was a very unpleasant time. And I suspect for those of us who still need to go to London for further education, we might still encounter pockets of this, notwithstanding, the image of a multicultural Britain and so on. And I believe the current British Foreign Secretary is of African origin. But that said, I think Britain still has yet to decolonize itself. So anyway, when Lee was there studying for his law degree, he encountered all these things. All right. Uh, People turned him away. As a poor student, of course, you want to rent, all right, the cheapest possible. But the moment they found out he was Chinese, because Lee, if you don't spell out the rest of the name, Lee can be a Western name. All right. So he thought that he could just get people to open doors for him just by saying, my name's Lee. But when he showed up, the moment they saw he was Chinese, he was the so-called colonial inferior other, they said, oh, sorry, sir, the room's taken. Okay, so that inculcated in him this disgust for colonialism. And then when he went to the shops, okay, as students, all of us understand. I was a student too. He was a student too. We live but within our means. All right, you go to the coffee shops, you go to the supermarkets. Of course, back then there were no supermarkets, just shops selling groceries. The moment they see you're from the inferior colonial other, and this goes back to Farisha's own research about how colonialism is built on engineering relations and stereotypes about inferiority. So Lee encountered all this in London and Cambridge. They will turn you away, or they'll give you very gruff service, or they'll sell you inferior produce, things that may be on the verge of expiry, sell it to you because you're an inferior person, and so on. So his time in London really brought it up. Okay, late developing outrage at colonialism, but it did, and so on. Now, how did all this translate into policy? You can say that um, once you've encountered these so-called uh, discriminatory attitudes, it stays with you. All right. And you also develop this idea that one day this white power should not continue to rule as they did undisturbed for the preceding 100 years, and so on. So this was how they developed their nationalism. And you see, this anti-colonial quality of nationalism that Lee and Sukarno exhibited cannot be found in your standard. All right. And I'm sure in your respective courses, especially if you're doing political sociology or the politics of nationalism in some courses, you'll be prescribed, as I would, all right, your standard reader, Anthony Smith edited or Hutchinson edited a volume of selected key works on defining nationalism. In these collected volumes, produced mainly by Western scholars, you will never find an anti-colonial definition of nationalism, right? And that's why it's important. I know it's been quite a while. This could have been done or should have been done 30 to 40 years ago. But I sometimes wonder why our predecessors, all right, the first and second generation of political scientists in this part of the world, why didn't they carry out this kind of deep study? All right. So anyway, my paper tries to give you this understanding, this articulation of anti-colonial nationalism to be us, the people, the nationally self-determining people. You have to find an intellectual and visceral criticism of colonial machinations. All right. But the thing is, you also cannot go overboard. How else are you going to be at peace with your neighbors and with the people you need to trade with? So this is the overarching dilemma. And then, of course, there are dilemmas further down, like personal friendships, as in Sukarno's case. Okay, as I've suggested to you, he actually was very personal in his friendship with the two Kennedys in the White House at the time. And yet, he regularly issued propaganda against the United States, calling Americans imperialists, running dogs of the capital, and so on. So how do you reconcile these things? Okay, it's an ongoing dilemma. Now, if you start reading the sources that I consulted for this project, you realize that Lee is not a deeply philosophical thinker. All right, his writings are to the point, and you need to read carefully between the lines to tease out his anti-colonial nationalism. All right, and in a way, Singapore's foreign policy as um, a strategy to defy its political geography is actually anti-colonial in its own way. Because when Britain created Singapore as a commercial outpost and subsequently as a military base, they never thought that it should become independent. It was always linked to either showing up the Dutch misgovernment in the south, in the Dutch East Indies, or as part of this larger British-run Malaysia or Malaya. Uh, so when Lee was suddenly told, please get out of Malaysia, we were briefly in Malaysia, as you know, for roughly 2 years and a few months, it was a shock because he had to do what the British had never intended Singapore to do, become independent and become, in a sense, self-sufficient in terms of extending its own trading networks, etc. So the very idea that Singapore had to strike out on its own and become a viable nation state was, you can say, in a way, its own ongoing anti-colonial story. But of course, if you read the propaganda coming out of my own government, you don't detect that. But it is actually by defying the odds because the British never prepared us for independence. In fact, the colonial powers never prepared any of our post-colonial states for independence. Right now, Sukarno has given us, uh, lots of his speeches. All right, either in the original Bahasa Indonesia or in English. Okay, and there's this wonderful volume produced in 1966 here in Indonesia that collects all his speeches from his earliest days, um, as a student in Surabaya and then in Bandung. It's all in there, officially translated. So this definition comes out nicely across time. The genuine nationalism is not merely a copy of Western nationalism, but whose nationalism arises out of a love for human beings and mankind. You see, this is very romantic. And again, if you look at his intellectual, the sources of his intellectual inspiration, they are a smattering, right, of Western thinkers, but he synthesized them according to what he thought was relevant. So he talked about a love for human beings and mankind. All right. So if you don't have this understanding, you cannot have a nationalism that will attract people and so on. You can say that this is very flowery, things that you would not expect to be easily operationalized. But that's what he truly thought post-colonial Indonesia should be. Yes, we bash colonialism, but we also extend our arms to our fellow brothers and sisters who are also trying to liberate themselves, all right, and make their own way in international community, all right. Now, when you look at nationalism as applied in the 1960s and 1970s as a vehicle for international decolonization, you realize that the dilemmas become sharper and sharper. Okay, I'm not trying to also whitewash both of them, Sukarno and Lee. They have their own contradictions in terms of what they preach and what they actually practice. But in just looking at their political thought, okay, and some authors, some analysts in the 60s had accused both of being wishy-washy, meaning their ideas are not fully developed political theory, not fully philosophy. They're just statements of an imagined future with very little foundation. Okay, whether you call it metaphysics or philosophical realism, they didn't spend time giving you these nice foundations that you could just put into a course on philosophy. But you see, this is the beauty of studying these kinds of global south post-colonial thought. People were trying to imagine a future in a hurry. Okay, and it's up to us today, 60 years on, perhaps, uh, to appreciate what they were trying to do, all right, given the context that they were operating in. So in the case of Sukarno, he kept banging on and on about the dangers of neocolonialism, all right. I'm giving you, of course, a very revisionist account of Confrontasi. All right, most Singaporean academics will stick to the official line and not subject it to further scrutiny. But you have to understand confrontasi as pursued by Sukarno against Malaysia, and of course Singapore was in Malaysia at the time, uh, with good reason, because he warned that colonialism may have retreated formally. They've lowered the flag. They've pulled all the colonial officials out of your capitals, but they're still there controlling your economy. They're still there trying to tell you how to govern yourselves. All right. So he made this speech. Okay, I'm surprised this speech was so nicely preserved in my in one of the in the National University of Singapore library. He made this speech in Phnom Penh. All right, not long after, before he was deposed. Okay, but you see how consistent he was. He said that uh, you know colonial powers will fight a rearguard action to keep some kind of new colonialism there. When they say that they will mediate, when they say that they will intervene on some of the ex-colonies' behalf to protect them, okay, he was obviously hinting at the defense arrangements Singapore and Malaysia had with the UK. All right, and this is something that still rankles in Southeast Asia basis. All right, so he was warning against all this as you know, examples of neo-colonialism, etc. And then he came up with this um, neo-socialist theory of Mahayanaism. All right, he idealized this mythical rural Indonesian farmer and a smallholder. You know, a smallholding farmer usually grows enough or rears enough cattle to feed his family and his immediate neighbors. So that was his understanding of what Indonesian socialism should be. All right. Can you find a nice parallel with Marx, with Lenin? No. Okay. With even someone not too far away, Mao Zedong? No. All right. It's him trying to draw on local intellectual and lived experiences to tell you that this is our way forward, etc. Of course, some of you will say this was too much of wishful thinking. Today, Indonesia's economy is, trying its best to look forward to a technological future. And farming, okay, farming is not something that I believe most of us here would encourage our friends, family, and relations to engage in, unless it's commercial farming on a large scale, and so on. But again, this was a lot of political visioning. Now, Lee looked at Singapore in a very practical form, through a very practical lens of decolonization. Practical in the sense that how he was asking himself, how is it that we need to scold the colonial powers? Okay, tell them, okay, they're not going to dictate to us anymore. At the same time, make use of their money and their military power to ensure that this weak little island that he inherited as an independent state could somehow survive, utilizing, ironically, some of the colonial powers' resources. So he had this unusual statement, uh, and this is, I think, a statement of Singapore's foreign policy today as well. Foreign policy for Singapore must be one to encourage first the major powers in this world to find it, if not in their interest to help us, at least in their interest not to have us go worse. If you do not like me as I am, then just think of what a nasty business it could be if I'm not what I am. In other words, this sentence is saying, let me be who I am. If I need to scold you and yet take your money, gotta accept it. Because if you don't accept me as it is, what is the alternative? Okay. At this point in time, Lee was, of course, threatening. All right. You can say it's a kind of subtle, or some of you might say not so subtle blackmailing, implying that if Singapore did not survive and create its own middle class in its own way, then we'll end up like Cuba. All right, we'll export revolution, we'll spoil everybody's economic growth, and then you see how you're going to conduct your Cold War. Either your Beijing, Moscow, or Washington or London. You see how you're going to deal if you let us, act as a spoiler for everybody else. Okay, so a bit of interesting reverse psychology there. Now, there's so much in the paper that I cannot cover in the presentation, but you also have to understand that in the final part, when you think about how the decolonized state actor, as directed by Lee and Sukarno, would try to reconcile their very strong, all right, and pungent um, anti-colonial rhetoric with support for international organizations like UN and ASEAN. Then you realize, okay, this part of my paper is very weak because I had to, in a sense, do it on the fly while grading and rendering other services to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This part I need to put in a lot more elaboration, but you can see that they had to make compromises. All right, anti-colonial nationalism must also meet their enemies part of the way. I won't even say halfway. All right. So in the case of Lee Kuan Yew, my own reading is that he's not a pure realist. Okay, he's an abridged realist, or you can say abridged idealist. There are parts of his writings, if you or his pronouncements of foreign policy, if you read carefully, they're very slippery. They are neither here nor there. And in this sense, he's actually not that different from Sukarno. Um, when he talks to a friend in the West, like Henry Kissinger, he sounds like a realist. All right. That's why Kissinger, I think, likes him. All right. Or liked him, the late Henry Kissinger. But if you read him carefully in terms of how he was part of this fabric of transitioning to a modern national post-colonial state, he's extremely slippery. All right. He wants the West to keep Singapore financially attractive, financially and economically attractive. But at the same time, he does not hesitate to tell them off. All right. So if you look at the entire period of Lee's foreign policy, he's had a number of rows with Washington, London, all right, and even with Canberra over various things. He even once, okay, and this was way before Mahathir, he threatened the British official airline, it was called BOAC at the time. If you don't give me what I want, I'll stop servicing your planes when they land in Singapore. He was in sense typical of his fellow leaders at the time. Um, and the same thing with the United States. Once upon a time, did you know that the CIA wanted to bug him, literally put bugs in his office, and it was found out. All right, they were found out. Uh, and they tried to satisfy him in a typical global South way. Oh, okay, dear Prime Minister, I know you're offended, but here's a packet of money. Can we consider the matter closed? He said, sorry, I need to tell you that I cannot be bought. And he actually said the CIA tried to bribe me with X number of thousands of dollars. All right. So Lee was playing these games with the Americans. And it's remarkable that subsequent presidents, even the first Trump administration, liked Singapore enough, all right, to want Singapore to serve as a meeting ground for some of their diplomatic initiatives. Okay, how ironic. Sukarno was more consistently anti-colonial and anti-imperial, and I've given you lots of quotes in the paper because he felt that um, you need to have this revolution in your mind. And in this sense, I think he was not that different from Mao Zedong and other revolutionaries across the global south, the third world at the time, in saying that to be completely self-determining as a new nation, you have to exist. Sorry, let me rephrase it. You have to practice this existential quest of decolonizing your attitudes. So when he said that we need to crush all anti-colonial, crush all neo-colonial plots, he actually meant it, and it was coming out of his personal experience as well. Okay, so in conclusion, I know that I've covered some of the ground that I intended to incompletely because this was written in a hurry. Um, but I hope that in the Q&A, you can help me to flesh out some of these points. That's the purpose of delivering this seminar, to get feedback from all of you. You have to understand colonial experiences are traumatic. All right. Whenever I have to go for an annual international relations conference in the United States, 2/3 of my fellow delegates do not appreciate this. Colonialism is traumatic because you set the standards. In a separate paper I published in 2021, and those of you, anyone from Ghana here? No. Okay, but you must have heard, you are from Ghana, good. You must have heard of Kwame Nkrumah's writings. All right, Kwame Nkrumah left us a very memorable quote in his writings. He said that when he first studied political philosophy, he was utterly shocked when political theorists in the West, and this is still the case, if you study political philosophy in any Western university, the canon, CANON, meaning these are like the standards, the big names. The canon are all white people. Isn't it frightening? All right. So Kwame Nkrumah said when he had to study for his university degree, this was so alienating. What about us? You mean we are not part of global humanity? All right. And this is also why, although I'm working in the same space as Farish, I'm also pushing this idea. And I had a nice conversation with Nia just now after lunch. We need to push global international relations as a project. All right. International relations has got sources in non-Western roots. It's just that I think Western thinkers do not want to make the effort to try to look for them. So we need to highlight them to the West. I don't know how long this task will take, probably beyond our lifetimes, but still we need to make a start. All right. And I always get very disgusted when I mean, professionally, I still have to engage, right, with the annual international relations conferences. Um, I get very disgusted when people say, "Oh, there's only these three great schools: realism, liberalism, constructivism, and the variations between them, and so on." Then what about the rest of the world? You mean we've got nothing to say about the international? Okay, so this is why I think we need to read this kind of improvised theorizing or quasi theorizing out of our first generation nationalist leaders. Um, okay, now Lee Kuan Yew is a bit of a difficult fit here, but if you think about how his very economically phrased anti-colonial nationalism was operationalized through the way Singapore made itself an important hub in Southeast Asia. You can say that it's still anti-colonial in the sense that the British left us with nothing. All right, they had intended us to be linked to some bigger hinterland that was empire. Okay, the British never made us consciously as independent states. All right. And again, sorry to bring up Ghana again. Ghana was important to the British because of agriculture. Cocoa is so closely associated, and gold. All right. Uh, if the British didn't see that in Ghana, would they have even considered keeping it as a colony? All right. So there are all these things that are part of colonial political economy. And you see, colonial political economy, Nia, perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, very few people are working in that area. Okay, people need to unearth these ugly realities. They wanted to take islands, they wanted to take away large chunks of land that are already settled because they are animated by the industrial revolution. They see resources for a modern economy that the locals did not understand at the time. So once the locals got uh, wise, they realized that they wanted the independence. Why should we be nice to you? We'll leave you as you are, uh, and then let you figure out. And if you look at some of this uh, anti-colonial writing, immediately, or rather, I shouldn't say anti-colonial, um, vengeful writing, and there are little samples of it here and there in the 60s and 70s by Western scholars looking at the international relations of the new states. A lot of them write in a very dark tone. They assume that all these new states will one day crawl back to the colonial metropole and say, please take us back. All right. And I mean, I'm not defending China here. China is potentially becoming a new colonial power through its Belt and Road Initiative. But that said, you have to understand that the Chinese are a little different in the sense that they're willing to negotiate according to local interests. All right. And they're always mindful, all right, of telling fellow Asian leaders, look, we understand we've all been colonized. Therefore, we're willing to be flexible in our contract negotiations for projects and so on. All right. So this is again colonialism coming back to roost towards us. Now, the anger against colonialism is still there in the it's still out there in the way I believe the global south looks at international order, and some of this echoes Sukarno's consistently loud antagonistic moral cudgels, all right, against the lingering evils of colonialism that will not let go unless you push and push against it, and so on. And he also made a very clear link between domestic decolonization and international decolonization. So if you don't decolonize in the domestic, on the international front, forget about it. Okay, so it must go hand in hand. And this is also our task as scholars and students of the international. All right. So I leave you with these conclusions. The final point here is that I conclude that Lee and Sukarno did not intend, all right, for me to deliver this presentation. Okay, and if some of you are trying to imagine a course on philosophy or political theory of the non-West that one day you might want to teach or assemble, you have to put their ideas in your syllabus as what they are. They were trying to give you a vision of the future in a hurry. Clear. It was clear that it was not well thought out. All right. It's not a fully formed theory like Kantian metaphysics, right? Or social contract theory, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's not fully formed, all right? And they are grounded in this anti-colonial anger. So we can appreciate them for that. And the fact that they fudge this distinction between anti-colonial nationalism and the embrace of something close to cosmopolitanism is what they've left to us. All right, and this is where I think if you look at Southeast Asia's very uncertain embrace of regional and international community, okay, we've always had very mixed feelings towards even ASEAN. All right, this is the side of ASEAN that a lot of people don't appreciate. Why is it that ASEAN is still not like the European Union? We don't have sanctioning power if someone violates an ASEAN resolution. Well, it's because we fudged it. All right, every ASEAN member says nationalism is important. We cannot allow a central ASEAN secretariat to say you've crossed the line, therefore you're going to be sanctioned. We cannot allow that. Okay, so in this sense, Sukarno is relevant to us when we look at the imperfections of ASEAN. The same thing with the UN. I know several of the ASEAN countries are right now quietly lobbying to be members of BRICS, trying to form some form of alternative UN. But again, this is at work. We want to be anti-colonial. We want to be truly independent and active in our foreign policy thinking. But at the same time, we also need to play with everybody else. Okay, so there will be compromises. There will be some awkward dilemmas we have to just live with. Okay, I'll leave it there. Perhaps there'll be more questions later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. We'll have maybe a couple of rounds of questions, but before I open it up to you, can I just make a couple of observations here? I think what Alan's talked about here was a particular historical dilemma that was faced not only by the countries of Southeast Asia, but I think it actually extends across much of the non-Western colonized world at the time. Even 50 years, 100 years before that, we see very similar debates taking place even in North Africa, across Central Asia. Armando Salvatore's book, Islam and the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, is a good example of this. It's looking at the Abdul Rida generation, asking similar questions, and also imagining a future where the Arab Muslim world will be free. But then the question is, what kind of freedom are we going to have in the context of a post-colonial state apparatus? So there's an engagement with modernity, and that's what Salvatore is talking about. Yeah, I mean, you talk about the dilemmas faced by people like Lee Kuan Yew and Sukarno, and I think that extends to all the leaders of the first generation of post-colonial Southeast Asia. Perhaps here we deal with the term, the phrase, bricolage. You work with the tools at hand. This is all you have. And if this is all you have, i.e., a former colony, you have to make the best with what you have at hand. Yeah, and yeah, as you rightfully noted, I mean, colonies are not democracies. They were never meant to be democracies in the first place. So overnight, you have to invent not only a new national discourse, you have to invent democratic praxis when there was never any democratic praxis. And so, I think the reason why I think your presentation is important is particularly when you look at certain sub-disciplines like democratic studies or whatever, there's a tendency to say, oh, democracy has failed in Africa, democracy has failed in Asia, or democracy has failed in South Asia or Central Asia. Well, there was never democracy in the first place. And then overnight, these societies have to reinvent themselves almost out of nothing. That's one. Two, you talk about where to locate people like Lee Kuan Yew and Sukarno within the orbit of the three main schools in IR, yeah, realism, um, constructivism, idealism, what have you. This can also be extended to all the leaders of Africa and Asia as well, yeah, because I think they were all facing similar dilemmas. So rather than the way you concluded, to say that this was a rushed job, could we not take another approach and just basically say, well, this was a case of very imaginative politics that took place in a situation where there were meager resources in the sense that your new country has no history, almost. It doesn't have a history as an independent nation state. It is almost entirely dependent on the international economic system that was pre-established. And also, as we said earlier, all these countries in Asia and Africa become independent and are immediately dragged into the Cold War, whether they like it or not. So I'm just throwing this at you, and you don't have to respond. But maybe it's something that we can discuss later. Anyway, now I've already abused my privilege. I'm going to open up to questions, queries, comments, and maybe I take a first round. So yes, we have one, first, second, and third. Okay, please. Yeah. Yeah. Can I pass you? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, mine's a bit of a half-baked comment. I, I'm from Australia, so I'm part of the Commonwealth, former colony, as you say. But we get lumped as part of the West. So I'm really only have snippets of a conversation rather than a comment. The description of Lee Kuan Yew going to England, that's what happens to Australians. So we look the same, but our accents are different, and we are understood in England to be ruffians, to be uneducated, to be all of those things that coming from a convict colonial past. So my comment is really just about definitions, about West and non-West. And I think in terms of the other sort of category of global North and global South, I think Australia has the same sort of ambiguity. I think Raywin Connell, who talks about power, actually makes an argument that Australia, if not part of the global South, at least is somewhere in between the global North and the global South. So I love the fact that you're looking at biographies and that you're looking at intellectual history of leaders. I think it enables you to go really deep. But I just wonder whether in the choice of Sukarno and Lee, there may be another category that comes from this ambiguous West non-West. You know that I won't keep talking but other people want to talk. But I just wanted to make that comment.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. First, I have I have one question, which is according to what we have discussing. You are talking about the two different approaches: the approach made by Soekarno and also the approach made by Kuan Yi. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing wrong. So it's okay. Okay. According to what I know, the approach made by Soekarno was basically based in charismatic revolution, third world nationalism, and also guiding democracy. Like what we know, Soekarno invited some of African leaders in 1955 in Bandung conferences to explain about the nationalism issues. And also back to Ling Kuan Yi, his approach was based in pragmatic development and also strategic authoritarian and regional realistics, right? So my question is, what the lesson can we what the lesson can temporary leaders learn from the success and the failure of Soekarno and Lee Kuan Yew in navigating post-colonial foreign policy dilemmas? That's my question.
Thank you very much, Prof. Alan. My question, how Malaysia built its nationalism as the part of its state building, what kind of new shared identity that that Singapore built? I'm sorry, because Indonesia, our founding leader concern was the unity of the country, the integration of the country. Therefore, for example, Bahasa Indonesia is taken from the Malay language, which is actually the language of minority. So the founding leader built a new shared identity. Some scholars say that in contrast to Malaysia, Malaysia can be said remain a multicultural society because it is not successful yet in building a new shared identity. How is it in Singapore? Thank you so much.
Okay, Farish, I'll respond to your questions fleetingly. All right, then we can follow up with a discussion later in the office. Now, the freedom after colonialism, okay, that is a wonderful project for a PhD in political philosophy or political thought. Okay, again, I'm throwing it out in case anyone wants to take this on. Okay, it's a fascinating topic. If I had time, I would want to take this on as well. What kind of freedom? So all this renting. Okay, and if you had studied the so-called international relations of new states, and this was 1968, 69, you'll be tracking this predominantly Western scholarship looking at Asia from the outside or sometimes from the inside, but with very prejudicial eyes, asking these new leaders, what kind of a roadmap do you have? Do you want us to take you back? you know, um, and some of this, at least in Singapore and Malaysia, uh, these questions were actually posed, mind you, in literature. Because I had to do a course in English literature in Southeast Asia, and this was posed amazingly in the very modern short stories of the time, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, Mokhtar Lubis, for instance, from here, Mokhtar Lubis, and Singapore and Malaysia, we shared the same English medium literature. They were asking these awkward questions in literature and not in political science or IR, which was very puzzling to me after I had gone through the PhD and I started thinking about these things. Why? Okay, and that's why also in decolonization or studies of decolonization, you have to go to literature. Okay, why literature? Maybe literature is part of the humanities. They don't have very rigid methodological boundaries, so you can ask all kinds of things about what freedom means. All right. So in one of my journal articles, where the mission, okay, set out by the lead author, because it was a special issue, they wanted to ask what experiences did Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia have in terms of striking an independent path during the Cold War. I found myself going back to the novels of Han Suyin. Someone said, oh, to me, just in a throwaway comment, oh, you should read Han Suyin's novels. Then I realized, oh my goodness, Han Suyin was such a revolutionary. She actually asked these questions. She didn't give us any answers. And she covered, I mean, in her mind, she never made a distinction between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. She ranged all over the place. And she even sexualized. Okay, this was very uncomfortable reading. And I didn't realize that she was so powerful because she had a failed marriage. In fact, I should say several failed marriages. So she sexualized the encounter with colonialism in terms of how one ethnic group was trying to inseminate another one. And then once the colonial powers changed, meaning the Japanese came, they tried to do it to the preceding one. You know, and I thought these kinds of very dark analogies did capture some of these awkward encounters with colonialism. So you also need to ask, once you push out colonialism, to answer your question, who are you now trying to debase? All right. Is freedom about dominating someone else? I mean, this is a dark side to it, you know. And of course, Sukarno tried to give you a very positive vision of what nationalism should be. You should love your own humanity. But how can you operationalize that? Okay, that's a big question mark, which relates to the last question about multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism is widely contested across comparative politics, across political theory. And I remember taking a course at the London School of Economics where there was no resolution. Okay, my British classmates with some Europeans in the room as well seemed to think that multiculturalism was a liberal construction. So in that sense, liberalism could work because cultures were all equal. You see, but as we've seen in the United States under the first Trump administration, you know, there's no presumption of equality. You assume that the new immigrants are going to generate crime in your cities. You see, and in the final days of electioneering, you all read what Trump said about Puerto Rico, right? They they are a floating island of garbage and things like that. And he said terrible things about people trying to immigrate from South America. So if liberalism tried to deal with multiculturalism, okay, how do you adjust this idea of freedom and equality? All right. Is it by treating everybody as universally equal without reference to race, religion, and lived experience under colonialism? All right. Sukarno and Lee seem to imply that you cannot undo that because it is in our experience. You cannot expect us to live as someone who has lived his or her entire life in North America under liberalism. We're just different. All right. And that's also why I was hoping for Kamala Harris to win, because she comes from the closest thing in North America to a colonial background. All right. Now, the idea of a rush job in political theorizing. Okay, this is an open question. I can't give you an adequate answer. If you had kicked out the colonial powers, what drove that? Okay, it is probably a sense of anger. You did not do justice for us, either economically or politically. And now you're just leaving. And I hope that, okay, in the most recent episode of decolonization, Hong Kong, I hope the Hong Kongers who are running away from China's authoritarian controls in Hong Kong are also reflecting. Britain has given a lot of them refuge. When they are in Britain, I hope they also reflect. Has Britain done any better for them than China? Because the British also treated, I mean, Hong Kong is now also the subject of certain critical histories of political economy. I've read one, again, the poor author, I suspect, was turned away by all the main publishers. He ended up with a sub branch of Paul Grave Macmillan. All right. And it's a very forgettable looking book if you don't read it. Okay. But I thought that this was a very devastating critique of British rule in Hong Kong because this author alleged that the British kept Hong Kong as a useful trading MAT, between a communist China and Britain and the rest of the world. So Hong Kong should never be completely content socially or economically. It's just a doormat. We need a trading spot in between our rival ideologies, because we still find trade profitable. So this is colonialism for you. And imagine if Hong Kong had to start out like Singapore, become a nation state overnight. What is your roadmap? Because the colonial power has degraded us to this point. So you have to invent something from nothing. At least Singapore and Indonesia had Lee and Sukarno respectively. They were making up things on the fly. And I suppose in retrospect, we're still better off for it rather than uh, living under colonialism. Now, the reflection about Australia, okay, thank you for this. It's so refreshing to hear this because I've never thought deeply about Australians experiencing this identity crisis. Okay, perhaps in Sydney, it's multicultural. I don't sense this at all. But in Canberra, and I think Canberra is still contains vestiges of this Commonwealth tie. Um, I've always felt alienated. Okay, not in the universities per se, but if you were living in some of the bed and breakfasts in the hotels as a passing through visitor, uh, you do feel that you are the outsider. No one wants to talk to you. They assume that you're passing through because you're a student or an academic, and you won't be there. You won't be part of their identity. So, yeah, your perspective is refreshing and never thought about this. Is there a third category? And I think we should invent a third category or a fourth category because colonialism, you see, there's no end to it. We haven't fully plumbed the full impact of colonialism. It's created these hybrid identities, you see. And again, going back to Hong Kong fascinates me because I always find Hong Kongers' attitudes towards their own politics and world politics very contradictory. On the one hand, your colonial creation, China wants to take you back. If you look back at your history, in terms of how Hong Kong was taken away by Britain as kind of indemnity because you did not allow us to sell opium to you, you know, morally, it's right that China takes it back. But in the meantime, identities have been created that are neither here nor there. So Hong Kongers, I think, are in a kind of terrible fix as well. Are they really Chinese? Ethnically, they share a lot in terms of cuisine and customs with the mainland and with Taiwan. But their attitudes, um, I don't know. I think they're very muddled, they're very pro-democratic. But when you force them to choose an identity, they probably won't give you an answer. You see? And yeah, you wanted to follow up with a comment. No, 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 by all means.
Because as you were talking, I was thinking about that ambiguous relationship that abused children have towards their parents, the violent parents. or can't between one another. And that, because Australia is still going through, shall be a republic or shan't be.
Yes, yes.
And I think that moving to those sort of disciplines and injecting interdisciplinarity into some of these discussions can take the conversation forward about identities and what seems to be irrational. If we have those sorts of human analogies through literature and through history. Because literature and history give us whole pictures.
Indeed, yeah.
If you go too deep into discipline expertise, you get fragmentation and professionalisation. Taking it out, I'll stop now. But it's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you too. Yeah. Okay, what practical lessons or lessons in general can we learn from Sukarno and Lee? Now, you see, my mission in this project doesn't give you a clear answer. I'm suggesting that they fudged it. All right. On the one hand, you want the moral right and the political right to scold the colonial powers forever if possible. All right. Yes, you can do that up to a point, but if you want to grow your economy, and this is where I think in their time, both men disagreed with one another. I mean, Sukarno never said anything positive about Lee Kuan Yew, although Lee Kuan Yew seemed to have been warmly greeted when he visited Sukarno for the first time before Singapore became independent. But I suspect they disliked one another because Sukarno probably saw Lee as the one who had caved in to the British. Because the way Singapore obtained independence from Britain didn't have a serious element of armed struggle. Sure, there were plenty of strikes, there were plenty of demonstrations, and Lee was in a way in bed with the communists just to push the British out. But Sukarno was actually more of an original strategist because if you look at the more complex parts of his writings, he actually said that nationalists need to be allies of Islamists and Marxists. Okay, and I can't give you a clear answer because on the one hand, if you need to grow your economy and you have to deal with all these tainted powers out there, you have to make some compromise, you know. And this is where I think the example of Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is also in this dilemma because they will proudly tell the world, and they like to encourage American tourists to quote unquote do the Vietnam battle tour or the Vietnam War historical tour. And they love to bring Americans to that iconic former presidential palace in Saigon. All right. And where they parked that tank, that iconic tank in that famous photograph that crashed through the gates, that signaled the end of the South Vietnamese US supported regime, puppet regime. So they like American tourists to go there and be photographed next to it. It's a way of saying in today's social media friendly terms, you see, you young people in North America, now you're finally legitimizing our armed struggle because you're taking all these touristic pictures and smiling. All right. And of course, you can follow on with how they like to bring Western tourists to the famous Chu Chi tunnels, where that's how the Viet Cong guerrillas hid. I mean, this is something that's being used by Hamas as well. That's why the Israelis had a tough time trying to get rid of the Hamas fighters. They dug tunnels that went everywhere, right to the US bases. And that's why they could appear and disappear quickly. And they want all these so-called modern and postmodern tourists to go there and be photographed. Now, this post facto on the cultural front, you see, that's why literature is important and the other disciplines. They're saying, you see, finally, tourism is helping me legitimize all their blood, sweat, and tears. This is Vietnam. They're playing with people's imaginations. But at the same time, they're also, if you want to push the argument against them, they're also guilty of double standards. All right? They are, okay, well, time is running out. They're guilty of trying to bring the United States back into Southeast Asia to counterbalance China. At the same time, when the US president, they said this in front of George Bush, they said it again in front of Biden when he visited. We had to fight you because we believe that imperialism has not died. And of course, both American presidents have to grin and bear with it. You see, you can say to the occupant of the White House. So this is the kind of fudge that I think a lot of these states are facing.
Okay, I'm going to. We are about to come to the end, but before I open it up, just to go back to your answer to the question, I have to raise this because you raised the critique of IR at the beginning, right? So the idea again that IR somehow provides solutions or answers or templates as if the world was flat and homogeneous and predictable. However, the examples you've cited, Lee Kuan Yew and Sukarno, point to the need of biographies, and these are all very specific and particulars. And in a sense, they can't be repeated. You cannot have another Lee Kuan Yew moment. You cannot have another Sukarno moment because those circumstances are gone. So, can I just ask you? And you don't have to give a long answer here. I mean, this is to do with IR, yeah. And the point made that literature and history give deeper answers, maybe not precise answers, but it throws a wider net. The thing, and you and I have discussed this, yeah, IR has this somewhat instrumentalist approach. It's like a tool you use, like a dentist's. You learn IR, you go and solve problems. You learn how to be a dentist, you pull out teeth. So that has its utility, but it also has its shortcomings. So we are still hovering around this question then, because what your presentation has done is that it's actually raised variables that are often not taken into account in IR analysis, biographies, microhistories, micro variables and things like that. So how do we get around this? Now, we have time for three last questions. First, second, and on this side, the third. Yeah, so first, second, third. And I have to ask you to be concise in your replies.
Can we go over 5 minutes, by about 10 minutes?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Yes.
Myself, Mohsin Ali from Pakistan, a former colony of the British. So my question is that how can we go with the decoloniality in the academic imperialism, that we can see that the knowledge creation is mostly from the West and come from the non-Western countries. But in non-Western countries, we are not the generating uh, the knowledge that is go for the West. So in this case, what the approach we can go with the decoloniality basically. So most of us, we have no approach to, just we have to challenge the colonialism. So what is the approach basically to decoloniality?
Okay. I think my voice is big enough, yeah? Okay, so basically, so I realized that this kind of topic kind of, trending at the moment. Yeah, in US, for instance, since the last 5 years, people start to talk about giving the nuance of international relations here into the historical disposition. But I have three questions. Basically, it's maybe some sort of some sort of clarification. Okay, let's just be short. Okay, I don't really agree when you say that Sukarno has been all the time, putting anti-colonial attitudes. Because in fact, if you look at the dynamic at the domestic and international level, there is something that has been played strategically. For instance, in terms of the national identity and international norms, for instance. Yeah, I remember I read this work written by Cindy Williams. He interviewed Sukarno and cited in that how basically Sukarno changing in terms of his attitude from being kind of prioritized on national identity, and especially the Thai type, where at the time the native Javanese was discriminated by by the colonial power just because of their dress, like the native, I mean, the appearance is not European-centric type of appearance. So it was a discussion among numerous groups of the Islamic circles, for instance, and the elites Briains. He was at that, supporting so much, strategically, like, okay, this is our culture, we have to be proud of it, it should be, and that he took it some of this as a national identity. That's why when you see Sukarno, you kind of look at his attire, from top to down, the clothes and the trousers kind of European, bureaucrats, Dutch, white. But the one he put on his hat is not that hat, but it is a page. The hat, the Japanese wore in their daily life. So there is that kind of strategic thing that I think the fact that he changed later on, to be more into fitting into the international norms. And at that time we can call that norms is confined under enlightenment type of norm with the ethical policy and etc. There is a kind of, a changing in his personality and how to fit in within the international circuits. So this is also, you may pick up the question why, then Sukarno aligned himself with the communist power. So yeah, so this is first the agreement. The second one, if your conclusion is in that way, the Lee's, because Lee has been compromising in his policy making, and then Sukarno has been, so far so much anti-colonial in a secretary at the international level, then indirectly you have agreed to the theory built by Niall Ferguson or Bruce Gilley when they say the country that submitted themselves to the good side of colonialism have been more prosperous than the country who has been, rebelled against colonial power. So this is also clarifying whether indeed, is this going to drag to supporting these ideas contrary to what we believe in the beginning? So yeah, I stop in there. So I think there's a kind of dimension, extra, I don't know, stuff that needs to be.
Okay, thank you. Maybe brief question is about the definition about nationalism itself, because I also want to focus on the nationalism concept, but especially in the resource nationalism. It is I do think that both of Lee Kuan Yew and Soekarno, they have different point of view in terms of nationalism. As first is, I do think that's about the political bargaining, and then something like liberation, and it's more to be more inclusive by, you said that Islamists and Marxists to be nationalism as well. We are not a narrow nationalism, but we are broader nationalism. And does it also relate, if we talk about the nationalism in terms of economic today, nationalism, its mean protectionism. Does it always is the case, or we can define nationalism based on, yeah, maybe global south or post-colonial countries? Yes, it maybe because of I do think that is it the case if we contradict nationalism with liberalism, or we can, yeah, combine it with our nationalism. Sometimes, yeah, we implemented liberalism. Sometimes we implemented liberation. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. I just have two questions that I want to ask, and the first one is, okay, one, right? Okay. Despite the limitations that these two countries face post-independence, Singapore
being a small island city-state, and Malaysia inherited an economic focus on primary extractive industry. How were they able to reconcile their decolonization with maintaining economic relations with major powers? That's my question.
Okay, I'll respond to your question in a one-to-one discussion later. What is the approach to decolonizing knowledge production in international relations and other social sciences? Okay, this is where, as academics, I know all of us, okay, have to make compromises. Our salaries, like in my case, has to be paid for by the civil service. So they lay their demands on my time. Okay, I had to service them. But on occasions like this, all right, and that's why it's a joyous occasion today for me to be here to say all these things. Right? This is what I really want to do. Okay, and I think all of us need to find the space in our lives, especially if we want to be in academia, to pioneer these divergent paths. Because this is why the humanities and social sciences are powerful, because they address our identity questions. And identity questions cannot be nicely put in a box or quantified, yes. And quantitative methods, those of you who are totally wedded to quantitative methods, okay, I apologize for these terrible things I'm going to say. Quantitative methods always assume that the phenomenon that you're studying is universally the same. I find this the case, and people don't think it through. For example, you go to any of the World Bank, IMF, WTO surveys, they treat all economies according to the same indices. How can this be realistic? Okay, two countries producing, oil, for instance, they've got their different contextual legacies. All right, some are good at fixing the price because they were in a cartel. I'm talking about OPEC, for instance. So in that sense, they are a leader between inverted commas. But what if you're not part of that cartel? You see, does this mean that you are the same oil-based economy? So this is the problem with quantitative approaches. And when you decolonize, sometimes you have to say no to these quantitative approaches. This is a battle that I never won in my school, in RSIS, because there are people who are trained, okay, sorry to say, in North America. And if you are trained in the mainstream universities in North America, you're forced to swallow this course as part of your graduating requirement. You do quantitative methods, or sometimes if they're kind, they'll say, all right, you don't want to do quantitative methods, pick up a foreign language and be very good in it. you know so this is a problem we face in our PhD training. Now if you, okay, I can't speak about UIII, okay, because I'm just visitor here. I hope that whoever's in charge of the PhD program here will be kinder. All right, because if you want to hear and really experience the global south, you need to appreciate these alternative methodologies. And I would say something positive about the postmodern, because the postmodern encourages you to read texts, all right, to look at the circulation of images, and so on, and surveillance. And all these are also alternative methods of decolonizing knowledge production. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. We can follow up later. Okay, Sukarno's attire and the idea of compromising colonialism echoed in Bruce Gilley and Niall Ferguson. Now, attire, again, is controversial. And this is also why I mentioned that we need to read, or really, or let me rephrase that, pursue the cause of decolonizing the social sciences by looking at alternative modes of control and production. So attire, for instance, conveys certain things. And this is where even the politics of tourism Again, I have only half a chapter in my upcoming book on the politics of tourism. In fact, someone should pick this up for a PhD topic. Politics of tourism are powerful. As I mentioned about the Vietnam case, they are playing with this global circulation of images of the Vietnam War. They want people to remember the Vietnamese account of how they reunified the country on their own terms. You see? So they want to dress up the tourist experience in a certain way. So when it comes to Sukarno, yeah, you can say that he's compromised. But if you want to make an impression in New York, at the UN in New York, I suppose you need to dress according to what passes for mainstream diplomatic power dressing in the UN. All right? Okay, but again, I think delegations from Africa are always very proud, okay, to wear their indigenous costume there. And just to make a point. And okay, this is a side observation. When I was living in London, and I'm Catholic by the way, I always like to attend the late Sunday mass, the last one of the day. I think it's at 6 p.m. And what I liked best was that the African Catholics all dressed in their tribal attire, and it was wonderful. So the familiar and the familiar hymns that you sing are sung according to local instruments. Okay, I pardon my ignorance. I don't know what the drum is that they bring from, I think, Zimbabwe. So your familiar hymns sound different in a local idiom. So in this sense, what do you call this? Cultural hybridization. And I think those of you in sociology or the study of sociology of globalization, the work of Arjun Appadure, he talks about hybrid spaces, right? So this is one way of looking at the complex world that we live in. And perhaps this is also to go back to the initial question about freedom. Maybe freedom after colonialism lies in embracing this hybrid culture. All right, where you may dress like the West, but you present yourself differently.
Thank you. It's hybrid, so it's not really about identity of a nation, for the people, but the hybrid between.
Yeah, so I suppose if we had a seminar, like say 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and you look back at Indonesia's identity, I suspect you will say that we have found a happy middle, whatever that middle is, where we are hybridized. We are not fully like the pre-colonial Malay world, while we acknowledge some elements from it, but we also take on some modern elements. All right. And this is a question I like to pose to Koreans too, because K-pop, I think, is too much of recycling, very, very, very bland recycling of Western pop music, and then they pass it off as K-pop, Korean pop, Korean wave, and so on. The last question about economic. Second last question. Okay, there's a last question from this side about economic compromises. Now, you see, this is why I think what I'm saying today is quite important. If you want to attract investment, you see, within a global capitalist economy, and I emphasize a global capitalist economy, you have to make nice to investors from the former colonial powers. I mean, this is the contradiction of Singapore's growth. Okay, I openly admit it. Now, in Singapore, I always find it uncomfortable. This is in the central business district. We kept the statue of Sir Stamford Raffles. Two statues, yeah. Yeah. Okay, where's the third one? Okay, all right. I've forgotten the third one. So we've kept two statues in the city center. Why? Because someone from the United Nations said to Lee Kuan Yew, you want foreign investment, you cannot scare them too much, right? So you need to keep Stamford Raffles statue there. All right. I walk past it. I don't want to look at it. All right. I know it's for instrumental reason. I don't like what he did. He conducted political, cultural, and legal violence against the people in this part of the world when he landed on our shores. You should read the story of the founding of Singapore, you know. And of course, it's up to modern day nationalists to read all kinds of things into it. You know, he basically said, we Englishmen believe that law means we write on a piece of paper and we sign our names. Whereas the Temenggung on Singapore Island said, no, it's not our culture to sign things in black and white. Our word is our bond. He said, sorry, we need you to sign. You see, that's the story of how colonialism got into Singapore. Yeah. Okay. So again, compromises, I can't tell you how to do it, but this was how Singapore did it. And that's why I have to strike this slightly apologetic tone when I contrast Lee Kuan Yew with Sukarno. Sukarno was somewhat, I think, more consistent. Lee Kuan Yew. All right. Okay. Okay, there's a second last question. Oh, okay.
Could be liberalism, or maybe the one you using liberalism economy, but in the same time they say that he said that it is socialism. Because I asked this one because when, for example, today when we refer to this as nationalism, it cannot like protectionism by democratic countries. Is it really the case, or we can still challenge this kind of issue?
Okay, nationalism as protectionism is a very, I think, tired argument. It's one-dimensional. But you see, protectionism can also mean I want to make profits out of my own people without sharing them with outsiders. It can just simply mean this, you know. So in other words, nationalism is just cover. It's not deep. But nationalism can also mean I want my own scientists to develop new technologies that I can corner a certain market for myself. Okay, so strategic industrial policy in political economy terms is one expression of nationalism. It's also, we can say, the story of the current microchip war. The United States started the most advanced production chain for microchips. It's all in that book by Chris Miller out there. But of course, Chris Miller is not someone who's paying attention to nationalism. But the story reveals the fact that the United States, out of just sheer creativity, produced the world's first most advanced microchips, and everybody wanted to copy it. And you see, I bring in Donald Trump again. He should not be part of this conversation. But you see, his is a fake nationalism because he ignores the fact that the United States willingly, on business logic, outsourced the production of these chips to Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and then now, and subsequently after China opened up to China. So when you say that China is undercutting the United States in terms of 5G and things like that, you know, who started it? You started it. And now you're saying that China is being nationalistic and threatening to destroy American jobs because this is global capitalism. So when you use nationalism, it's very hazy. But I suppose if you ask Sukarno this question, if he was standing here, he'll probably say, I want my own scientists. That is, I think, more substantial economic nationalism than all the others that I've just described. Okay. Yeah, there was another question here. I think that was it. That was it. Okay. Any other remaining questions? You can still come and talk. Oh, there are 3 questions. Okay, you can talk to me after this is over.
All right. So, thank you very much. You can see that there are still hands being risen, but we've already exceeded by 15 minutes. But I'm sure you can catch Professor Alan as he heads towards the taxi after this, and can still ask him questions. Just he's got till 5. Okay. So anyway, in closing, and in particular related to some of the questions that were raised earlier. Yesterday, I went to Indomaret, which is in front of the campus, and I bought some liberalism. And when I bought the liberalism, at the back of the box, it said, "Don't mix with nationalism." Right? You know, So if you think that's absurd, think of how we use these concepts in our disciplines. And I think the great utility of your talk, Alan, is that it's made us question, right? We talk about liberalism, nationalism as if these are ontologically given things. It's not an object. These are ideas. And I think the importance, and especially I appreciate the point about history and literature and alternative approaches, as social scientists, yeah, this is what we do. We are not studying seashells or crabs or prawns. We are actually studying human phenomenon, which is complex. And I think the tools that we use need to be complex as well. And I think what you've done today, even albeit in a very focused way, to give us two personal biographies of two leaders who, at certain points in Southeast Asian history, I think played a very important role in determining or trying to determine the identity and subject position of their respective countries. That's something which is often left out when we do these macro analysis. So I think there is a need for this. Nobody's saying that macro analysis is not important, but I think we need to temper our approach by also taking into account the need for micro analysis as well. That doesn't impoverish our academic work. It enriches it, in fact, right? So thank you very much for enriching us. And ladies and gentlemen, can you join me in giving a round of applause? Yes. Dr. Alan says he's prepared to entertain the remaining questions. So now we go to full karaoke mode, right? And so you can do it in a very informal way.
Yeah,
You can?
yeah.
Yes, yeah, sure. So anyone would like to come forward, take selfie, photograph? Yeah. Yes, yeah, we do take photo because this is. Yes. Oh, okay. Tall guys in the back. Tall guys in the back. Let's go back.
Ayo, ayo. Yeah, we have tested different scenario, right? Yeah, we have tested we can send you lecture as well. Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. You will have stroke and then how many times? Oh my God. Okay, I'm gonna make
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, go first. Yeah. It's okay. Take your time. Yeah. Sorry.
Kita bisa ketemu.
You see, when this there was
Gak tahu pada skill market. Jadi kawan media saya.
Jadi non media. Yeah.